Welcome everyone. We're happy to launch the second day of the Psychology and Economics of Poverty convening. We're incredibly fortunate and delighted to have Abhijit Banerjee joining us today. Abhijit, in addition to being a professor, the Ford Foundation Professor of Economics at MIT, also, as all of you know, is a co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and in 2019 is also the co-founder of the Poverty Action Lab, which has had outsized influence in really revolutionizing and changing the field of development economics as it's known. Aside from that work, Abhijit has been a very early and consistent champion of work that incorporates insights from psychology to understand poverty. And some of his own work has incorporated the idea that people have limited cognition and limited attention in studying why the poor remain poor. And so he's incredibly insightful, and we're really looking forward to this conversation. So the way the format is going to work today is we're going to do it as a question and answer so that we can really just hear Abhijit, what he thinks about things. And so I'm gonna, the way we're gonna start is I have a set of just 4 general prepared questions. I'm gonna ask him a question, he'll give a response, and then if people in the audience have follow-up questions related to what Abhijit has talked about, put them in the chat and I'll read out ones that I think are relevant and might be of interest to the group. And then at the end, we'll hopefully just have time for general Q&A where we'll just open it up and people can ask questions themselves for things they're interested in. Okay, so let's get started. Thanks, Abhijit.
Thank you for having me. It's odd to have a fireside chat at 8:30 in the morning, but it's not 8:30 in the morning for me. So it's good. I can be drinking my evening tea.
Well, you know, now that I'm used to living in California and it's 50 degrees outside, it feels like I need a fire. So in fact, I probably would welcome one now that I've acclimated to the weather. Okay, so let's start with the first question. So Abhi, you've been doing a lot of work recently on the effects of cash transfer programs and universal basic income. And so these programs obviously help the poor by just making them less poor. You give them money, they can buy more stuff with it. But then there's also this interest on whether the effects of cash transfer programs could go beyond that. They might also have psychological benefits for the poor. And so there's a lot of research that's using these programs as really just a lever to study the psychological consequences of resource constraints. But that work is still in very early stages. And so I was hoping you could start us off by talking about your work on cash transfers and UBI, what we might know about the psychological effects of these interventions, and then perhaps most importantly, your advice on how we as researchers could use these kinds of interventions as a tool to better understand the psychological consequences of poverty. Like, are there some approaches you think are promising or less promising, that sort of thing?
It's $1 million question in some ways. So let me, I don't have answers to all of that or even very credible hypotheses, but let me try to say some things that might, then maybe we can take that further, you can respond or something. I think that, I mean, sort of going from the, I think part of what I think is maybe valuable in making the connection with psychology is just descriptive. I think that our description of what it is that constitutes well-being is often quite distorted by our sort of disciplinary legacies. And so we often don't ask the question, is this something that's actually making people better off? And you could imagine that not necessarily having the same answer. It's not just the amount of money, it's also how it's given to you, how you're treated when getting the money, what choices were you given, do you actually feel stressed by the fact that now you have an opportunity, you got some money, but that itself creates its own pressures because now maybe it's your one chance to either succeed or fail. Or there's a whole set of descriptive concerns which are already, I think, quite important in understanding how sort of social transfer systems should be designed. I think this is a, I think if you think of partly what's happened, I mean, this is a sort of a significant theme in our recent book, Good Economics for Hard Times, just the fact that, I think one of the things that happened since the 1970s is sort of a dehumanization of the welfare recipient, of that, you receive it, therefore you are somehow less. And so I think that there is a whole set of issues which have to do with how do I measure both, I think, what is this actually, what's the, how do people assess the mode in which you receive the money? Is there in other words, the discourse around that, is this arms given to lesser people, or is this something that's part of a broader social conversation about who are the indirect victims of changes that are not necessarily of their making? I think there's a whole range to be had there, and I think one of the things that we are trying to get at more now is, and I think that's maybe just to get to the idea of what I think would be both, I think, in terms of tools and in terms of consequences for policy, critical is to understand how the design of certain policies, the conversation that goes with that design, the way we present these policies matter. So I think part of the charm of UBI is precisely the acknowledgement that it's, I'm not giving it to you for something or not. And I understand there are lots of reasons not to choose UBI. In the end, we argue against UBI in our book. But I think one of the reasons why I think this conversation immediately connects to a whole literature that is sort of maybe not properly integrated in the economics literature is just on this question of what is it that it means to you? What are you? Are you? Is it that you're getting something, and it's being taken away with the other hand because the way it's given to you is not very pleasant? And I think that sense of what is your right, what is your expectation, what is your interpretation of the act? I think this is one piece. I want to start with that because that's almost that's the one that I think is most missing in our conversations, in my view, is that we talk about stigma, but stigma is kind of seen as being kind of a very specific welfare stigma. Oh, I don't want to be one of those people who gets welfare. But I think the broader question of design, I think that there is interesting evidence on that from the US, for example. The fact that the SNAP payments are made through cards makes a difference. People, but I think that the general question is much broader than that. Can we design the programs that are more sympathetic to people who are receiving them? And I think that's a large space in which it's not a space where I've done much work, but increasingly I am convinced that that's a critical ingredient of the story. That programs that are somehow insensitive to the recipients deliver less in important ways, and that's something I cannot show you. I cannot, but I think it would be very interesting to pursue. Following on that, I think then there is the set of issues that I do know a little bit more about, which is the set of issues on, what are the causal channels that go through psychological elements. And there, I think your work with Sendil and Frank. That's a very good example of that, where you can see that people. What's very nice about that is the fact that you see that people really, even a very small manipulation on their, on how much money they have access to, seems to have effects on the ability to focus on the job. And I think what's very nice about the work is precisely the demonstration that it's really, it's very mechanical, almost like, you lose attention in a very identifiable way. And I think that's very nice. We have some work that's complementary to that, based on the graduation program. We did an RCT in Ghana on the graduation program many years ago. Part of that RCT was a piece of that was designed to sort of tease out the causal channels of why, what does getting an asset, kind of a randomly assigned asset, do to your willingness to work. And of course, we start from the theory that should discourage you from working because the income effect will. Now, we don't find that. I think mostly many studies include, we summarize a bunch of studies in a different paper, don't find that. But I think what's more interesting, and I'm not surprised we don't find that, by the way. I think there are many reasons we wouldn't expect it. We might see that, people, for example, capital does a lot to relax your productivity constraints. You might actually now have something to do and therefore you might work harder. So there's nothing particularly surprising about that. But I think what is sort of more special about our experiment was that we managed to sort of set up this bag factory in rural Ghana, where we produced about 117,000 bags over the period of 3 months, I think, where in the bag factory, we were actually letting people, giving them the option of making extra money by producing bags. And we did, and what's in that experiment, what we're trying, one of the things we vary is, the unconditional cash transfers that people get. Now, the reason why that's an important piece of the design is that we wanted to give people something that was, relatively small, so they don't immediately run out and buy machines. And in particular, look at the productivity effects on things where no machine plays a role. We gave them everything they needed to make the bags, we gave them. So they didn't need to go buy anything. So therefore, no capital constraint to be relaxed. And it's not even that they could go and buy a tractor and therefore save their labor on their field. And therefore, so we don't see any, and predictably, we don't see any effects on their buying tractors because it's a small amount of money. When you vary that small amount of money, you see, and this is what's maybe a complementary to your results, is that this is over a 3-month period. We see that the productivity is substantially higher for those who are getting more money. And they are doing the same job much faster. And there are 2 classes of bags, the easy bags and the hard bags, and they're doing the hard bags and they're doing it correctly, et cetera, et cetera. So you do see a very clear and I think very substantial productivity effect, and which isn't likely, you can't completely rule out some very convoluted channel through which they save some other resource. But the most obvious explanation is clearly that these guys are feeling more happier or confident or more, and therefore they are more able to just deliver on the job. They're just able to get themselves to do it better. So I think I feel that's also very revealing. I do want to say that both how people react to getting it and how that changes behavior. Both of those are important. It's both important. It doesn't have to be that people somehow improve, and therefore that's what validates the psychological approach. I think it's important to just say that, if people are happier, more confident, more able to, less depressed, I think those are valuable in themselves. And then I think it's also important that it changes behavior. And I think we both, I think, are underexplored. In particular, I think for us economists, I think the productivity links are, there's really very little on it right now, and I think there could be a lot more, obviously. But in particular, I think I think what is maybe most necessary is sort of a more long-term. If there's a way to connect this to more long-term productivity effects. So are they making just much more, very different, yours is over a few days, ours is over a few months. I think in principle, the effects could be over many years. And that to me is completely unexplored in a sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's, I guess, like a challenge is to do those kinds of things, to use variation. It's hard to find things like you were able to shut down all the other kinds of channels that could lead to increases, and so figuring out ways to do that, or maybe following your participants for a long time and having them make bags again in the future or something like that.
Yeah, no, I don't know how to do it. That's but my general view is that the reason for having the events like these is to provoke some young person who's much smarter than me to go and do it, and then show us that it's been done. So I feel like this is my chance to provoke all those people to do something really great.
And so I think that your paper, I think, or just what you said, raises two questions for me. So I think one thing that's really remarkable about your findings in that paper is that it's not, yes, people are more productive, as you can see, because they're doing well on the harder, more complicated bags, but it's also clearly almost looks like an increased willingness to just supply labor. Like I could just sit home and not do this thing, but I'm richer. And so as economists, we tend to believe that when someone gets richer, their willingness to actually put in the effort to supply labor rather than sit at home and, have tea is going to go down. And in fact, when Paul Niehaus was presenting your joint work on UBI at Berkeley, some weeks ago, the labor economists were like, what do you mean labor supply doesn't go down? Like they just couldn't compute this idea that you can make people.
It never goes down. I guess we have this paper which sort of covers with Ben Olken, Gabriel Kreindler, and Rima Hanna which just reanalyzes data from a bunch of our cities that were done for transfer programs, and we basically find nothing. I mean, there's a bunch of them, and none of them find that people suddenly become lazy when they get a cash transfer. It just doesn't seem to be there. And I think I sort of take that as being, that's not really that interesting to me. It's interesting that economists seem to find it interesting, but I don't think it's that interesting to me. I think it's not that it couldn't happen. It could happen that, if you had a completely awful job and somebody offered you enough money to not do it, you may not do it. And that would be good too. I don't think that for most people, I think being able to do something is actually part of their modus vivendi. And so I don't think there's any real reason to assume that this is what's going to happen. So to me, it's more interesting is why it happens and what are the causal channels than why isn't there a negative income effect on people?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly important for the policy debate, because one of the things that the biggest thing that holds people back from wanting to give away cash is this idea that, then people will just not work and they'll be lazy. So I think it's been impactful, even if it's not surprising to you.
No, I agree. We call our paper the myth. The paper I was just kind of with Ben and Rima and Gabriel, the myth of the lazy welfare recipient.
Yeah.
So that's, I think we got
debunking the myth of the lazy welfare recipient or something, right? I think it's called. So So I think one other question I think this line of work raises for me, or your answer raises for me, is that if you think about your paper, our paper, or if we think about studies that maybe aren't designed in exactly the same way, but even in the U.S., I think we see evidence, or there's work that poor people in the US face these same kinds of challenges. And if you give them money, their mental health or other things could improve as well. And I think one thing that's puzzling and that hasn't really been resolved or addressed in this literature is that surely in absolute terms, a poor person in Oakland, California is much richer than a poor person in Ghana, where you did your work. But we see these effects. And so part of this is surely that your expectations for how financially constrained you feel is guided by your expectations of what your life should look like. And that's very much determined by the society around you. But if that's true, and so if it's going to be the case that if I'm poor relative to others, I'm always going to feel this need to catch up, then should we be thinking about this as a need to reduce poverty in levels or increase wealth in levels, or to reduce inequality? Like, is it the case that as long as there's inequality, we will have people who are relatively poor be financially strained? And I think because I think the pushback that one could get is the end logic can't surely be that we have to give away enough money that like everybody is middle class, or is that the logic? How should we think about
that? When I was a grad student, I wrote a paper which probably no one has, probably appropriately no one has read, called Envy. It's published somewhere. And I think the paper makes exactly this point, which is that, you can, a small amount of relative income preferences can justify very large redistributive programs. And even in a case where there is some labor supply effect and all that, so, but I think that, let me put my cards on the table. I don't see anything particularly shattering about saying that we need to reduce inequality a lot. I think even if it doesn't change people's behavior, it makes them extremely unhappy. I think, but having said that, so I think it's completely true that people care about what's normed consumption in society. Whether they care actually about people's incomes or is less clear. They care about something, but when I look at the evidence on relative income, that seems less clear than the idea that when I don't meet a certain basic standard of living, that makes me very unhappy. And that basic standard of living clearly depends on what others have. So I think I think those are different in that way. So I don't know which of them is actually, I think both probably operate, but I suspect that there is some part of this which is just, I don't want to be the person whose children go to school without the right clothes, because in some sense that they are going to feel bad about it. I don't want to be the person who has to who lives in a house that looks like it's from a developing country. I mean, I think the norm of consumption is important to people in a way that's sort of, I think, Veblen's point. Veblen's point was very much that it's more the norm of consumption that drives preferences. And so I think that there is there's clearly some value to trying to separate those, because I think they have different implications for how much redistribution is absolutely critical. Then I'm happy to go further probably than many people, many economists, but I do feel that these are different stories, and the stories, both stories are probably right, but I don't know how much weight to put on each of them.
Got it. Okay, that's great. And a reminder to the audience that if you have follow-up questions related to what Abhijit is saying, you can put them in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat as well at the same time. So let's move on to another question, a different topic. So one stark fact about poor countries is that youth unemployment is really, really high. And you see this, in Africa and South Asia and Latin America. I mean, I guess we see it among developed countries as well, or more developed countries as well. But in research that's been presented at this conference, we've seen examples of unrealistic over-optimism, where people just seem to hold beliefs that just cannot be justified by, information in the world or even their own experience. And this relates to some of your own recent work on voluntary unemployment among youth and labor market expectations they have that seem biased. Can you talk more about that and what, and just also build on that for other things that you think are interesting in that general area?
Yeah, so I think that, I think that the fact that people have, I think what's at least the older US literature was suggested that people search and they learn the distribution reasonably quickly and in the market. And I think that was mostly done with sort of structural models and with a lot of assumptions about optimization built into it. As we dig deeper, I think it's clear that maybe that's over-optimistic, or maybe actually I want to keep that word away. Optimistic is, so I don't know. So first, I think that we're starting to see more and more of this, as you say, more and more people find the same thing, which is that a lot of people seem to have kind of expectations that are hard to justify based on people's experience. What we find is that when you expose people to sort of the hard reality a little bit more, for example, by giving them, our experiment was in Gauteng in South Africa, where these young men from Soweto and women from Soweto were given subsidies to go look for jobs in the central business district in Johannesburg and Pretoria, and what you find is that does lead to an expectation. So they start by having extremely optimistic expectations, but extremely optimistic expectations that in their own terms seem implausible. I want to insist on that. So the experiment was, we do an experiment. I'll tell you what the result is. But the expectations they said, the median answer is I'll get a job within 2 months. They haven't got a job in 15 months. So how could you why would you think the world would change in the next 2 months? So even in their own terms, the expectations seem unrealistic. And then when we give them information, they do adjust their expectations, but not like all the way down to reality. I think Alan Kruger has a paper where he finds the same thing in New Jersey, that people don't adjust their reservation wages down all the way. So I think that you find very much that there's some movement when you expose them to the labor market, they don't get the jobs that they thought they would get. They do adjust in the right direction, but the adjustment is still relatively limited. And I think, and that makes me think that an interesting issue here is sort of the role of motivated beliefs. I think it's very hard to let go of your sense of what a life could be. I think that's part of the challenge here. And you see the same versions of that same fact in like in India, for example. You have all these newspaper stories, but they're actually correct, that 2 million people applied for 50,000 jobs or something, or actually 20 million people applied for 50,000 jobs. I mean, there's just the numbers seem absurd. And if at that point, there's no point in applying. You know that you're not going to get it. In particular, you know that you'll have to then take an exam. And if you happen to be already been in the bottom half of many other distributions, why would you think you're going to win this lottery? So, and I feel that maybe, and it's easy to say this makes no sense, but I think probably we're underestimating the extent to which it does make sense, which is that I think people need to let go of the dream slowly. And they want a life, and the job is just a mapping for the job is just a representation of the life they want. And then maybe they were not going to get it, but I think it's very hard for people to be, wake up in the morning and say, okay, fine. And I imagine that life A, which I will have a professional job, I'll sit in an office. I'm going to now take life B, which is where I'm going to deliver, I will become a bicycle delivery person, and I'm going to just do that. And I think that transition is not easy, and it's not easy for reasons that I think all of us understand. I think we hold on to things, that relationship will be somehow redeemed, even though it looks very implausible or something. We hold on to dreams all the time, of sometimes unreasonably. And I think that I think is, but I think it's not because we are just unable to interpret the data, but because we really need to hold on to. So there's always a dimension, degrees of freedom in that. You could say, but I'm different. I'm going to be, somehow it's going to be different from me this time. Or I think people tell themselves stories. I think that's part of what's going on. Let me just finish can I just say one more thing? The other thing I think is going on, at least in India and probably in South Africa, maybe not in the US, is family. So I think parents will also kind of collaborate in this process, where I don't know whether the parents, we have all these people. If you look at in India, the unemployment rate for people who are men who are in their 30s, the non-employment rate is 2%, 3%. It's really every man is working. Mm-hmm. At 25, it depends on whether you have 10 years of education or not. If you have less than 10 years of education, that number is basically also 2%, 3%. Mm-hmm. If you have more than 10% of 10 years of education, then it's more like 25%. Oh,
wow.
So these people are transitioning. They will eventually get there. They'll all end up in the bad jobs that they don't want. But I think for the parents also, it's a dream also, maybe for you to have a child who is really a success. Otherwise, and so maybe it's the gambles are all, everybody's happier thinking that we still have a chance till you're 30 or something. And you can see that, a lot of especially in India, the government jobs, they have age deadlines which are around 30. So when you get to 30, you sort of know that, okay, fine, you got to 30, you're not going to make it. And you see a very quick transition in the labor market back to what looks like, realistic expectations. And so I'm not entirely, so I think this is super interesting. I have not managed to get anywhere close to this, I think, what is the core issue, which is how much of this is really welfare relevant, valuable, maybe misperceptions. So I don't know, and I don't know exactly how to even parse that. We don't really have a language for that in economics or something like that. But I'm not convinced that makes it wrong.
Yeah. No, and I think that in psychology, there's a tradition of a view that it's not even clear that you want people to have realistic expectations if you think that these are, relevant for welfare. And so I think there's, these great statistics on so all of us think we're above average drivers or above average in everything. But if you look at the people who have realistic beliefs, depressed people tend to have accurate beliefs where they won't say that, right? So that in itself is telling. And is this idea in psychology that Dan Gilbert has coined of the psychological immune system, and kind of you need to hold these beliefs to be kind of a functioning, happy person. I guess, like, I don't know if you would have a view on this, but so the way I feel like this has ported into economics is through, I think, of what is nascent but burgeoning set of work on belief-based utility, that basically, that the beliefs you hold affect your utility and your happiness. And I think that the direction that's taken is in this realm of motivated reasoning, that I kind of decide to hold a set of beliefs, but I think those kinds of models kind of have this approach where, as we economists do with everything, then I'm going to pick some optimal thing to trade off costs and benefits. So I'm going to optimally pick some unrealistic beliefs, because the more positive my beliefs, the happier I feel. But there's going to be a cost that I take the bad action, and I'm going to balance those. And I think psychologists that I've talked to have looked at that and think that's like totally loopy, because that requires you having some meta like awareness of what's happening, and then you pick the thing you want. But there is work in economics that seems to sort of start supporting these models. And so I don't know if you have a view on how to think about motivated reasoning and belief-based utility.
I guess I think the problem is, I don't have a view, in the sense that I have exactly that discomfort with both that optimization, but I think the deeper question is, what is it? What does, once you go down that path of allowing people to be wrong, maybe we should lie to a lot more people. I mean, it's not clear to me where one takes that. Whether or not, in some sense, the immune system seems like a good thing to protect, but why stop there? I don't understand how one thinks about. I mean, these belief-based utility. Should we then take them as being welfare, or should we think of them as being things that are descriptively relevant but are not welfare? I think the wedge between welfare as some concrete policy relevant object and utility as something that decides us it becomes extremely important here. I don't know that we have much that to say about it that's that useful so far. I think maybe I'm being too negative, but
okay. No, I think that's interesting, and it's fair. Like, I think that there's certainly something that's a commonality that in terms of people who are finding work in support of this, but whether it's really an optimization that's happening, or they're just finding evidence that people get some utility out of holding, I think that doesn't necessarily imply optimization, and I don't even know.
It doesn't imply optimization. It doesn't necessarily imply other third parties should take put full weight on that or not. It's not. Yeah. And because if we did, then we should maybe be lying to people a lot or something. I just think that all of those are complicated issues.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, I think that on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, so there's evidence of people having over-optimistic beliefs, but there's also just this view, and I think this is coming even in questions in the chat, of what happens in the absence of that, in the absence of optimism, when you have pessimistic views. So in your book, your terrific book with Esther Duflo, Poor Economics, you have this, you talk about poor people having a loss of hope, in the sense that there is no easy way out, and that in turn could make them less likely to try to take proactive things like saving for the future or other forward-looking actions. And that is at a tension with, or seems contradictory also. At the same time, we see so much abundant over-optimism. And I'm just hoping, or I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about, what you see or what you've seen in your experience, or in research that you've seen on pessimistic beliefs and the role they might be playing, or how we might understand those better.
So, I mean, I'm not sure there is a tension there. I think people. So let me go to an example that I often use, which is in healthcare. If you look at very poor people, one of the things that you notice is that when you tell them they have cancer, they don't, and that they, the treatment will cost much more than they can afford. It's not that they don't do anything. They do little things. They go to, they go to the witch doctor, or they do something. So I think that there is, I think that I think people need to, this goes back to what we're discussing, I think people need to hold on to hope. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're holding on to the right hope. I think that the question is more, is it the case that, I want to navigate, my day-to-day life, and I hold the motivated beliefs that allow me to do that, but I don't actually, the beliefs that would be necessary for me to actually transform my life, or maybe I don't take on. So I don't think that necessarily one or the. I think I think people are often optimistic, but not necessarily about the things that are not always about things that are transformative over their life. In particular, I think that, so I don't know, again, this is not very different from the question we started on, which is, what happens when you get an asset or something? Do your preferences change? Do your beliefs change? And I think we see some evidence of that. I don't know that there is more to be said about. So I think being very poor seems to be discouraging. And whether discouraging is the same thing as having pessimistic beliefs or not, I don't know, because it could be either that people just feel tired, or that they feel that there's no point in doing something, and maybe those are different. But I don't particularly see that there is. I think that I think we sort of have this vision of people being, okay, this is the best thing I can do, and I'm going to have a patient, long-term, step-by-step path to get there. And I think that's a very demanding psychological idea. That, I'm going to, so when you're very poor, it just seems to me that, you might be optimistic, but you optimistic about the lotteries. You take, like, I'm going to apply for this job and maybe I'll get it. But yeah. There's other kind of optimism, which is, I'm going to go step by step from point A to point B. And that's going to be require 10 years of hard work. And those are different kinds of optimism. And I feel that, we should probably keep them separate. The optimism, over optimism that makes you want to wait for a lottery is not the same optimism that says that, I'm going to just, climb up this hill, whatever it takes.
That's really useful. I think my video is freezing. That's super useful and actually really helpful. I think I hadn't considered the difference between those. And it seems to also relate to something you've written. I think it's in Poor Economics of, like, it's not just that, like, poor people that have to think about that step-by-step thing. The difference is in rich countries, like rich people, we have institutions that kind of do that step-by-step for us. Like, we don't need to make the 10-year plan. We just make the 6-month plan. And when we get to that goalpost, there's an institution that says, now take your SATs, and then, now finish college, and now do this. We don't have to do that long-term planning.
Absolutely. Exactly.
And so this conversation, right, so there's a couple of questions in the chat I just want to read out that I think relate to this. So one is from Francesco Flores from the University of Kassel, which is, he says, could it be that high expectations are related to aspirations and hopes? If so, high optimism might increase effort and produce better outcomes, following Dalton and co-authors' theory of aspirations and economic cycles. And then Mahesh Srinivasan from the UC Berkeley Psychology Department. I think when we were talking about the potential negative and positive effects of, like, over-optimism in terms of actions and beliefs, he says, it does seem like there's a tension here between the potential negative effects of over-optimism versus the potential importance of raising aspirations. A balance would be to have aspirations interventions be carefully calibrated to what is possible while acknowledging the structural barriers that people face. Does that seem like a useful strategy?
Yeah, so let me, I think that sort of, I think some of the things I said recently probably are part of my answer to that. I won't repeat myself, but I just to get to one piece of that seems to be important. I think to Mahesh's question, I think one issue that worries me is I don't even know whether or not so there is the question of the kind of the instrumental value of optimism, but there might also be a direct value of optimism, as optimism makes you do the right things, or no, not the right things. But then there's a question of optimism just makes you enjoy the meal you're eating today. And I don't know, I consider that equally valuable. And so in that sense, I'm less convinced that one should only use the instrumental frame for it. The bread and butter just tastes better when you're optimistic.
In fact, we had a paper presented yesterday that showed that exact thing, that when people are cognitively taxed, they derive less utility from eating food.
That's interesting. I would love to see that paper. I sort of believe it.
So I'm gonna Mahesh put this in the chat, everyone. But even for the general Q&A, even if it's unrelated, given that we have 10 minutes, just so that it's a little bit more manageable, please just put your questions, even unrelated to what we've talked about, in the chat. We'll scan them, and I'm sorry that we might not be able to get to all of them. In the meantime, let me ask Abhijit my fourth prepared question, which is, I think, really relates to what we started with and the work that you've already done on the effects of cash transfers, but maybe we can expand on it a bit. So, work in the psychology of poverty these days is heavily gravitating towards the role of limited cognition and limited attention. You wrote one of the earliest economics papers on this, it was called Limited Attention and Income Distribution, which is a model of how limited attention can disproportionately hurt the poor. Now, just these ideas like this more generally, what is the role of attention in perpetuating poverty, is a set of ideas that the field is now starting to test the relevance of empirically. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on what are some particularly interesting or promising directions for research on limited cognition or attention. I think a lot of people in this audience are thinking about those ideas, and we've discussed two papers, your paper and my paper, that look at the effect of cash on productivity, but do you have other sort of thoughts on ways to proceed?
Again, this is it would take longer than we have to, I think, properly answer that. But let me say just make the connection to one thing. I think we sort of think of limited attention as being, we are allocating a cognitive resource to the different tasks, and maybe we have less of it, therefore we do less well. But I think that one of the things we learned a little bit from, I think, from the Sendel's book on scarcity is that it's also something that it's also very much about the way we catch you. So in some senses, it goes back to the just to explain what you said about the way, for example, decisions are often taken out of your hands, and that might be a good thing. So I think part of this question is also about should we, so we sort of we have this idea that somehow giving people many choices is a good thing, and it might well be that it's just people have to. In fact, I find one of the points we make in poor economics is poor people have to make so many choices all the time. So it's also that the structures are often. So one of the issues I'm interested in is this question of, is there a way to provide programs that are take certain decisions out of people's hands and make them actually better at doing what they're doing. It's not clear that, I think people have so many choices to make. Should they get vaccinated? Shouldn't they? Should they not work today and go get vaccinated or not. Or I mean, I think this is right now. We've been talking a lot about these kinds of issues, but it's something that I think one would imagine dealing with using good institutional designs.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. I mean, I think the automaticity, or just what does that look like? I guess the challenge is, as a researcher who's trying to then think about that, there is, when a policymaker does it, we sort of think, okay, well, it's a policymaker who's been elected by the government and they're solving something. I guess in terms of that kind of automaticity, if you're working in a developing country where institutional capacity is weak, we may not trust the government to come up with something sensible. And then you want to come in and think about either doing research on it, or then how might one proceed in thinking about how to promote sort of beneficial automaticity?
Yeah, I agree. That's exactly right. But that set of issues seems super interesting to me.
So let's. So there's a question in the chat from Maddie McElway. You're a former student who's now at the Stanford King Center as a postdoc. She's asking. She has two questions. I'll start with the first one. How do you see behavioral development economics as distinct from behavioral economics in poor settings? So is it the case that a lot of the work that's done is just behavioral economics and we end up doing it in poor settings, or is there something intrinsic about studying poverty through a behavioral lens that we should keep in mind or think about?
No, it's a great question. I don't know I don't have a great answer, but I do feel that what we just talked about is a bit relevant to that, which is how much of this is institutional rather than, so is it the case that different institutional frameworks make certain issues more relevant than others? We think of institutions as being mainly about whatever contract enforcement, but I think to me, institutions are hugely about what decisions do I have to make? What can I take as granted? What can I delegate to the state, if you like? And so I think those are issues. So I do think that the institutional issues connect very much to this question of, should we think of it as being, so I think different contexts therefore matter for other reasons other than poverty, which is the institutional context matters.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Maddie's second question is, how do you view the relative importance of cognitive and social psychology in poor settings? Is there more value for poverty reduction in changing cognitive processes or the social environments of the poor?
I don't know. That's an excellent question. Maddie should do research on it, or somebody else should do research on it. I don't know. Good question.
So, I think going back to our earlier conversation about, cash transfers and UBI, you mentioned that in the book, you ultimately conclude that maybe UBI is not the right strategy. For those who, haven't yet read the book, could you expound a little bit more on that to loop back to?
So what we say specifically is that in countries like the US, UBI may not be the right strategy. They might very well be the right strategy in a country which is less able to target well. So I think the point we're making is that in the US, actually, there's lots of, we know who are the actual victims of certain policies. There's a certain places where slated to be destroyed by opening of trade with China or moving something from one list to another. And those things, we had the information, and those people are clearly, in some ways compensating them is something we take as given in economics when we say that we'll do this policy and we don't do then we don't do it, of course. But I think so. I guess we make the point in the book that I think country like the US, you really want to think of. There is plenty to go around. You just want to start by compensating people who are, victims of shocks that are not of their making, and that's very different from UBI, because it's targeted not based on what you do, but based on what happened to you. Mm-hmm. And whereas in a country like Kenya, you might say that, look, we just don't have the information to target on various things. So, but the cost of letting people to the mercy of the market is too high, and therefore if we have to do something, it needs to look much more like universal. It doesn't have to be 100% universal, but it has to look much more like universal.
That makes sense. So then let's end with our last question, which I think, which is related to this idea of shock. So about COVID. The question is from Fernando Pacheco from Central American University in Nicaragua. He's asking, would you say the new COVID context with more welfare transfers and government aid involvement have changed the expectations and social perspective people have around these kind of welfare support? Or would you say it's only a short-term effect?
I don't know. I hope people what COVID has done very effectively is underscored the fact that, a virus came and lots of people who had done nothing economically wrong in their lives got clobbered. So maybe people will realize that that's a general metaphor for how a lot of market economics function. A lot of things happen. People get clobbered. They don't get compensated. So maybe there is a more general lesson to be drawn. Maybe people won't draw it. I don't know.
No, and I think for those who are interested relating to this, there's on the Berkeley Conversations website, Paul Niehaus has a terrific set of graphs on just how much welfare support has expanded and how many countries have adopted things like cash transfers in the time of COVID. So I agree. I hope that continues. So thank you, Abhijit, very much for joining us. It was really a fun and interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I think sparked ideas for me for research. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you, everyone else, for tuning in.